Over the years, I've had the privilege of interviewing some of the most famous feminist provocateurs: Germaine Greer, Gloria Steinem, Naomi Wolf, Canada's Doris Anderson, and a few others. Writer Betty Friedan started me down the feminist road when she penned The Feminine Mystique. Today, some women are reluctant to claim they are feminists, and some embrace the F word fully. That and more intrigued Michael McNamara to direct and co-write a documentary called The F Word: Who Wants to Be a Feminist? It is my pleasure to welcome Michael McNamara to Studio 4 to tell us more. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So I guess I have to ask this question. Are you a feminist?
Absolutely, yeah. You don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. There was a question we asked a number of women, is it okay for a man to be a feminist? And obviously, I think what's good for women is good for men. It's good for families. It's good for humanity, really.
How do you define it? How did you define it before you put this documentary together? Or did you bother to define it?
Well, it's funny, it was one of those words that, when I was growing up, I came of age in the 70s, and, I was interested in all kinds of sort of radical thinking ideas, like, the anti-war movement and migrant farm workers and those kinds of things. And I was a teenager, and I got politicized very quickly by a group of young women in the early 1970s who, were starting to call themselves women's liberationists. And that was the term that was used, and it became a kind of derisive term after a while, women's liber, that kind of a thing.
Yes.
And the word feminist kind of crept into the conversation sort of a little bit later. So I always sort of kind of equated it with that particular movement. I didn't really sort of give it a lot of thought, but we realized that it was the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day next week, on March 8th.
March 8th.
And so we had been talking to the CBC about doing something around that, and we started asking questions of young people that we know, my niece, my nephews, and asking them if they would refer to themselves as a feminist, and most of them avoided the topic. They didn't want to use that word. They felt like they espoused those kinds of values and ideals, but they didn't feel comfortable describing themselves as a feminist.
Humanist?
Yeah, that was a word that came up a lot. Yeah, I'm a humanist, and I think it's a kind of a shame because it's I think feminism is something that you actually have to kind of very consciously kind of engage with, and so does my partner Judy Holm, who co-wrote this with me. I have to say, you probably noticed I'm a man, so
Yeah, I did.
So it was something that we did a lot of talking about as we were trying to figure out how to approach this.
And there were some early feminists who thought men should not be included in the movement, and that did change. But there were some early fighters for equal rights for women who thought, men get everything else. They're not getting this.
Yeah, that's true.
Not the smart ones, not the Steinems.
Yeah, no. There was this, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why the word feminist became a kind of a derisive term, was because because of those sort of exclusionary, much more radical thinking people, and I think it sort of served the purpose of anti-feminists to kind of point to them and say, look at them, that's what a feminist looks like. But as we know, a feminist looks like a 6-year-old kid, who's holding up a sign in the International Women's Day Parade. That's what a feminist looks like too.
For sure. Equal rights, equal pay, equal opportunity, all of that. Who would be against it?
Absolutely.
However, to be labeled a women's liber in the 60s was not always a compliment. I worked with the late Pat Burns. He was a hotline host and a reverend and really great. But he would say to his producer, go get that liber down the hall, that women's liber, get her in here. I want to talk to her. And I thought, okay, I'm right here. And yes, I am, and here's why. And it would be something about abortion rights or Morgentaler or something like that. So it was really interesting.
Those are the stories they gave you, huh?
Of course.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and we had media watch and, what's wrong with this picture and how women were being depicted in magazines and in movies. And it was not so subtle when your dress flipped up and you were in your pantyhose walking down the road with your briefcase. That didn't portray us the way we really were, so we questioned that. You took a hard look at feminism back to Prohibition in this film. Prohibition worked in that way, in that the Women's Christian Temperance Union came to the fore.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing that kind of got women out of the house initially. You know, it was you know, alcohol. I mean, alcohol abuse was, you know, widespread and a really serious social problem, and so you know, the Women's Christian Temperance Union sort of mobilized, you know, women. It was basically seen as a way to prevent violence in the home, you know, which continues to this day to be a kind of a, you know, an issue, a feminist issue, and a human issue really. But that mobilization, suddenly these women were out of the house, they were, you know, marching in the streets, they were getting to know how to sort of engage politically, and they thought, well, wait a minute, how come we can't vote?
Sure.
And, you know, so
Exactly.
yeah.
And of course, now women can go into the men's side of the bar. Remember those
right.
days, there were men only in Alberta.
That's right, ladies and escorts was the
Ladies
other
and
side.
escorts,
Yeah.
or men only. And you had to sneak in if you wanted to talk to your husband because he was in the men only section. However, that's all changed. So the waves as they go. First wave was getting the vote. Susan B. Anthony lying in the street in the United States and in Canada. 1919, women got the vote?
In Canada, 1918, 1919?
1918, I think,
I
yeah.
should know these things.
I should know these things too. 1919, all women, they changed the right to vote law.
Yeah.
Then the famous five got together later. The Supreme Court defined us as persons.
That's right. So women could be in the Senate.
Yes, that too. And
yeah.
Nellie McClung and the girls,
Yeah.
or the women,
The women. That's
got
right,
on
yeah.
that. So that was really first wave.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And then second wave,
Well, sort of second wave came out of the whole sort of the post the Second World War, beginning of the baby boom, and women suddenly were kind of discovering that maybe what was going on in their lives wasn't quite enough.
that's Friedan's fault.
It's Friedan, but yes, actually Betty Friedan and Germaine Greer as well with her book.
The Female Eunuch.
Female Eunuch. And,
Yes.
yeah. And so you know, really the leaders of that movement were for the most part journalists, writers, you know, people who were writing these critical essays on you know, what was wrong with the world.
Well, for people who were not alive or paying attention in the day of Germaine Greer, we have a clip from your movie, from your documentary, The F Word, and it's I think Larry Zolf and Greer mixing it up on television. Let's take a look.
It also cast Greer in the role of feminist leader and media target.
In Time magazine, where somebody described women's lib being infiltrated largely by deviates, perverts, lesbians, queers, and, you know, the riffraff of our society.
The question is what truck drivers like to have neurotic women like you.
You think I'm a neurotic
well,
woman? I have controlled myself all the time in this situation. I have not insulted either of you, whatever
right,
my
fine.
private opinions
All
may
right,
be
fine.
about
I'm
you.
just
And you
saying-
have both. He has called the women I work with by every filthy name he could lay his tongue to without being bleeped out. And now you're trying the same
I'm
game.
suggesting
I
that
must say it's disgusting.
I found
I
it-
was attacked quite a lot. There were lots of silly things, like women reading the book in a plain brown wrapper, scared to read it on the train because of what people might do or say. Banned in South Africa. How about that? I was delighted.
And I'm sure she was delighted. She was wonderful. I had a wonderful time interviewing Germaine Greer, and she told me a great story about mowing her lawn in Australia. And she sheared the blade off the lawnmower. Called the handyman in town and said, Germaine Greer here, I've sheared the blade off my lawnmower. He said, are you sure? And she said, you can imagine what she said. If I was a male and called you and said I'd sheared the blade off my lawnmower, you'd say, bring it in. And because I'm female, you think I don't know, you know, what makes a lawnmower mow the lawn. And it went on.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought the poor guy in town's just thinking, okay, miss, bring it in.
Oh yeah, we were a little intimidated when we were interviewing her. Actually, my partner Judy was interviewing her, but you know, we had heard stories that she won't suffer fools lightly, and she's very, you know. So, but we spent a couple of hours with her, and it became a real sort of a challenge to try and figure out just how much of this we could fit into a 42-minute
I'm
movie.
sure.
You know?
Yeah. What's she like today?
She's just as well. She's become a lot more active actually in sort of environmental issues, which is kind of interesting. And she's this past year was the 40th anniversary of the publishing of the Female Eunuch. So. And we wondered whether or not, you know, it kind of stood up to the test of time, and it really does, actually, I think, very much. A lot of the ideas And a lot of the concerns that she had back then continue today. You know, so.
Well, that's the thing. Not too many women on corporate boards, certainly not enough women in Parliament.
Yeah.
The female voice is still not being heard in North America as much.
Yeah, on average, women make 20% less than men, you know, in this country. And you know, one of the other sort of really shocking statistics that we came up when we were making the film was that there's this the World Economic Forum does this actually it's every couple of years they do a kind of a report card on what countries are treating their women the best in terms of access to health care, in terms of corporate boards, in terms of pay equity and so on. When they first started it 5 years ago, Canada was number 7 in this, you know, this big group of, you know, a few dozen countries, and so we were standing up pretty nicely. 5 years later, we're number 20. We've fallen behind the United States and Sri Lanka. I mean, in the way we treat our women, which is, you know,
At a corporate level, at a social level?
in a whole basically a whole sort of smorgasbord of things like pay equity, access to child care, access to abortion, and yes, corporate boards, political representation being a really big
No
issue.
kidding, because when you look at that, 21% of the seats in Parliament are filled by females.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about yelling and screaming for affirmative action, but encouraging more women to run. And as you know, many women don't run because they don't have enough money to run.
They don't have enough money.
Or support.
When they get treated shabbily by the media. I mean, you look at what happened in the last presidential election, you know, if you look at, I mean, even, you know,
Yes.
despite what you might think about Sarah Palin, she was really treated badly by the press.
And
as
Hillary
was Hillary,
Clinton.
as was Hillary, yes, absolutely. Yeah,
That's why she doesn't wear dresses much, because they talk about her ankles.
Yeah, and then it's the pantsuits. They make fun of the pantsuits then, you know?
She's Secretary of State. Wouldn't you think we could get it together?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe we will after this documentary. Who
hope so.
knows? So that's the second wave, really. And Gloria Steinem, what did you think of Steinem?
Well, I have to admit, we didn't actually, you know, the clips that appear with Steinem in the film are clips
Are from
that
before.
are from before. We weren't able to kind of, she's pretty busy. She's continued, she's like in her 70s now. She's still writing, she's still touring around, she's still, you know, so she was impossible to pin down,
Sure.
actually. But she's, yeah, I mean, and she's, you know, whenever we talk to anybody, she's basically their hero. I mean, she's, you know, and she's mine too.
Well, and she was, I hate to even say this, but she was so beautiful. And somehow that worked. It does, in case you haven't noticed.
Yes.
Beauty works. She was smart and she was gorgeous, and women wanted to be like her.
Well, this is, you know,
Not that you have to be beautiful, but
no.
she was, and that worked, and it worked with men too.
Yeah, well, that's the whole idea of positive role models too. Is, you know, that was the other kind of question we were asking, is like, who are the positive role models today? You know, for young women. I mean, back then, you know, you had people like Mary Tyler Moore, you know, who was this, you know, a successful career woman, and
Right.
and then and Gloria Steinem, and there was Wonder Woman. I mean, those were the really popular and positive female role models
Yes.
in those days. Today, who do we have? We have
Premier Christy Clark.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, but and Lady Gaga.
Not Lady. And Lady Gaga, see, I like Lady Gaga.
Oh, yeah.
But Lindsay Lohan, no.
Not so
Not
much.
my role model. There you go. We'll come back.